Hey, you've made your way to Dim Pixels, my little home on the interwebs for retro video games. Thanks for stopping by. Today we're looking at a game I was intrigued by as a child but never had the opportunity to play it until now. This is a Super Nintendo game based on the Dungeons & Dragons universe. It's Eye of the Beholder by Westwood Associates. Now, this is actually a pretty important game for me to cover. Maybe. As I hope to convey within this video, of course, it's not just something that I wanted to play as a kid, many others did too. In fact, many others actually did play the game and it was super popular, so even if this is the first time you've heard of it, Eye of the Beholder is a pretty big deal when it comes to video game history. But let's take a step back. What even is this game? Honestly, it's a D&D campaign. The Lords of Waterdeep are concerned about an evil lurking below the city, so they hire a team of adventurers, that's you, to check it out, and you and your team enter the dungeon, find the bad guy, and make him not alive. And that's about it. There's quite a lot of role-playing to it too, actually. Right from the get-go, you choose all 4 characters and their background and what they do. It's not quite on par with modern character creation, but it was interesting for what was available at the time. I just wish there was a little more guidance as to what you might need, but that's maybe part of the learning experience. In reality, this is a dungeon crawler. It's seen in first-person perspective, you move one step at a time through a claustrophobic dungeon, and although it's not turn-based, attacks have a cooldown, so it kind of feels turn-based in a way, maybe. However, it's definitely an interesting game. More than I expected. It's fun, even, which I was somewhat surprised to discover, mainly because this isn't my type of game. And yes, it's very, very old school. It is a dungeon crawler after all. Even modern games of this type still tend to feel very old school. It's almost like a living board game in a way, but somewhat more dynamic. In some ways, this does add charm. In others, it can be frustrating and limiting. I found the controls awkward at first, but as with all things, it got easier with time. After a while, I discovered there's actually one button you can use to switch between movement and mouse controls, which worked really well once you figured it out. Up until then, I kept making silly mistakes because I had no idea what button I was pressing. It also took me a whole run through, which didn't last long, to discover how to attack. In that first attempt, I watched all 4 of my characters die one after the other because I had no idea what to do, and that was all on the first enemy I encountered. Nice. As you would expect from a game like this, party composition matters. You need to have individuals with different skills in order to approach the puzzles. However, I also discovered that the positions of these individuals within your party matters as well. And if you don't put fighters in the front of your party, you can't attack, which from a design perspective, well, I felt it was pretty dumb. I think I understand what the devs were trying to achieve, but ultimately it felt restrictive instead of realistic. It's the reason my second playthrough ended fairly quickly as well. Equally important to keep in mind, because this is a D&D game, it adheres quite closely to the D&D rules, which means you need to learn spells, you need to rest, and you need to do things that seem counterproductive at the time. After my very first battle, I chose to rest to recover my health, and it took 140 in-game hours, which just seems silly, especially if I was to do this after every battle. Part of the reason this happened to me though probably had to do with the fact that I had no idea how to heal, and no idea how resting really worked, and no idea how to really fight. But what really matters is I had fun. In fact, it was really fun to explore, although it was way too easy to get lost, and that was perhaps my biggest issue with the game. The reason I only ended up playing for about 45 minutes before I gave up is because I got lost and couldn't find a way out. When I finally found a ladder, hooray! I figured I was going to go to another part of the dungeon with new scenery instead of the same brown walls, but no, it looked exactly the same, except now there were false walls, which look the same as the real walls until you notice they have a rune on them. That is, if you notice, but even if you did notice, it didn't help much because it's so damned easy to get lost. And, well, I cracked the shits once I found my way into this particular room where I kept going around and around in circles because I had no idea where the exit was. It's a stupid room, and I'm sure the devs are laughing at me. So where did this game come from? Anyways, well, Dungeons & Dragons itself is as old as video games, and games based on it were released as early as 1975, which is hard to believe, but apparently true. However, in terms of games known to pop culture, Adventure is probably the first major game of this kind, although it didn't take the first-person perspective. Pool of Radiance was quite popular in the late 1980s, but although it leaned far more into the role-playing aspect, it still used the top-down perspective. It wasn't until Dungeon Master, which was released in 1988, that the dungeon crawler archetype was born, although that title was not based on D&D. It is, however, considered inspiration for Eye of the Beholder. And Eye of the Beholder did incredibly well. Not only is it considered one of the best D&D games ever, it's also considered one of the best computer games of all time. It has likely influenced many games since, and spawned itself 2 sequels, both of which were also quite popular at the time, selling about 350,000 copies between the 3. These are now all available to purchase on Steam in the bundle Forgotten Realms: The Archives. Apart from that, it's not too hard to find the original Super Nintendo cartridge. It's not stupidly expensive either, but it's not really that cheap. Beyond that, there was a Game Boy Advance remake released in 2002 under the title Dungeons & Dragons: Eye of the Beholder. This Super Nintendo version was itself a port. In fact, the game was originally released on PC and Amiga in 1991, was also released to Sega CD not long after the Super Nintendo. A Lynx port was also developed at the time, but it was never released, so there are plenty of ways to try it out, really. In fact, fans have even made Eye of the Beholder modules for Neverwinter Nights, and a fan port of the original game was made for the Commodore 64 in 2022. All of these games are available for free if you want them, but of course for the Neverwinter Nights modules you do need to own the base game. As I said at the beginning, for much of my childhood I wanted to play Eye of the Beholder. I read about it in magazines, I fawned over the photos and wondered what it would be like to play it. And now that I have played it, I'm honestly not sure if I want to try again. Maybe one day I will, but on PC, now that I have the Steam version, it would probably make more sense with mouse and keyboard to me. For now though, I got my fill, I enjoyed my time, and I'll probably let it go for a little while. But it's also important to keep in mind that this just isn't my type of game. If you stick with me here on the channel, you learn that I really only like fast-paced and not overly complex RPGs. Anything slow, and especially anything turn-based, which this game isn't, but especially anything turn-based, just turns me off. So this was fun, but it's not really my style. If you like this kind of game, I really do feel there's enough substance here to warrant a full playthrough, and if you can get your hands on it, which you can easily on Steam, I think you should give it a whirl. For the record, I did grab a copy of the bundle. And that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed this look at Eye of the Beholder, and I hope to see you back next week for more retrospectives. Let's play all the games.